The gavel strikes, and the courtroom erupts in laughter as the judge mocks a 17-year-old girl, calling her a wannabe attorney. But what they don't know is that Sophia Miller is a self-taught legal prodigy, armed with brilliance and a burning determination to expose the truth. With her neighbors' freedom on the line and a corrupt legal system stacked against her, Sophia steps into the fight of her life, unraveling a chilling conspiracy that could destroy powerful figures and reopen her brother's wrongful conviction case. Before we dive into this gripping story, buckle up, get ready, and don't forget to subscribe for a special surprise tomorrow. Sophia Miller sat at her small, cluttered desk, the soft glow of her desk lamp illuminating a sea of open textbooks, printouts, and handwritten notes. The sound of her pen scratching against paper filled the silence of her room as she carefully studied a case file she had downloaded illegally from a public database. At 17, Sophia was no ordinary teenager. While her classmates worried about prom and college applications, she spent her nights buried in legal precedents, trial transcripts, and courtroom strategies. The goal was singular and unwavering: to free her older brother Ethan from the wrongful conviction that had stolen his freedom and shattered their family. Ethan had been sentenced to life in prison 5 years ago for a crime he didn't commit. A murder pinned on him with flimsy evidence and a rushed trial. Sophia was only 12 when it happened, but the image of him being taken away in handcuffs, their mother sobbing uncontrollably, was seared into her memory. With no money to hire a decent lawyer and no faith in a system that had already failed, in them, Sophia had taken it upon herself to fight for Ethan. She devoured every legal resource she could find, taught herself to analyze cases, and wrote hundreds of letters to attorneys and advocacy groups. But so far, nothing had worked. Tonight, her focus was on a similar case she believed could provide new insight into her brother's appeal. She squinted at the fine print, her sharp mind processing every detail, when a sudden noise from outside broke her concentration. Voices, angry and loud, echoed from the street below. She stood and peered out the window to see a familiar figure being handcuffed and shoved into the back of a police car. It was Luis Reyes, their next-door neighbor, and a kind-hearted man who often helped Sophia's family with small errands. His wife and children stood on the sidewalk, crying and pleading with the officers. Sophia's heart sank. Luis was the last person she'd expect to see in trouble with the law. Grabbing her jacket, she rushed downstairs and out the door. The scene was chaotic. Neighbors had gathered, whispering among themselves as the police read Luis his rights. "What's going on?" Sophia asked one of the officers, her voice trembling with urgency. "He's under arrest for robbery and murder," the officer replied curtly before turning away. Sophia's mind reeled. Luis? Murder? It didn't add up. He was one of the most genuine, hard-working people she knew. If anything, he'd barely been able to make ends meet, working long hours to support his family. Luis's wife, Maria, turned to Sophia, her face streaked with tears. "Please, you have to help him," she begged, clutching Sophia's hands. "You know he didn't do this." Sophia didn't know what to say. She wasn't a lawyer. She was just a teenager pretending to be one. But as she looked into Maria's desperate eyes, something inside her stirred. She couldn't ignore this, not when it was so painfully close to home. The next morning, Sophia woke to the sound of murmurs outside her window. Peeking through the curtains, she saw a group of neighbors gathered in hushed conversation. The arrest of Luis Reyes had shaken the community. He was the man who fixed cars for free, helped elderly neighbors with groceries, and always greeted people with a warm smile. Yet now whispers of guilt began to circulate. The police were claiming Luis had committed a violent robbery at a local jewelry store, leaving the clerk dead. For some, it was easier to believe the accusation than to question it. Sophia stepped outside, her mother calling after her to eat breakfast, but she ignored the suggestion. Maria Reyes sat on the stoop of her small house, clutching her youngest child to her chest. Her face was pale and tear-streaked. Sophia hesitated before approaching, unsure of what to say. "Mrs. Reyes?" she said gently. Maria looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "They're saying he did it," she whispered, her voice cracking, "that he killed someone. But he was home with me that night, Sophia. He never left the house. How can they just take him like this?" Sophia knelt beside her. "Did they show you any evidence? Anything at all?" "They didn't tell me much, just that someone identified him as the man who ran out of the store. But that's not true. Luis didn't do it." Sophia's stomach churned. Eyewitness identification was notoriously unreliable, yet it was often enough to convict someone, especially if the accused couldn't afford a proper defense. She asked Maria for more details, but the woman didn't have many. Luis had been taken to the county jail, and a public defender had been assigned to him. Maria's hands trembled as she clutched Sophia's arm. "Please," she pleaded, "you have to help us. You're smart. You know about these things. They'll destroy him if we don't fight back." Sophia hesitated. She wasn't a lawyer. She was just a teenager with a pile of books and a desperate dream to free her brother. What could she possibly do? But as she looked at Maria's tearful face, she couldn't ignore the knot forming in her chest. Luis was a good man, and if the system had failed Ethan, it could fail Luis too. "I'll do what I can," Sophia said, her voice firm despite the doubt clawing at her. "I'll start looking into the case." Maria grabbed her hands, crying softly in gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. As Sophia walked back to her house, her mind raced. She needed to see the case files, understand the charges, and figure out how the police had built their case. But more than anything, she needed to be sure of one thing. If Luis Reyes was innocent, she would do whatever it took to prove it. Her heart pounded as she grabbed her notebook and began writing down everything Maria had told her. This wasn't just about Luis, it was about justice, and Sophia wasn't about to let another innocent man's life be destroyed. Sophia's hands trembled slightly as she clutched the notebook filled with hastily scribbled notes. She had spent the last 2 days poring over news articles and online reports about Luis's arrest, piecing together every shred of publicly available information. The evidence against him was disturbingly thin. A single eyewitness who claimed to have seen him fleeing the scene of the robbery, combined with an old, blurry security camera photo that vaguely resembled Luis. No fingerprints, no murder weapon, nothing concrete. Yet the prosecution had confidently moved forward, as though they didn't expect anyone to question their narrative. The courtroom was packed for Luis's preliminary hearing, buzzing with a mixture of morbid curiosity and quiet tension. Sophia sat in the back, her notebook tucked under her arm. She had tried to speak to Luis's public defender before the hearing, but he had barely spared her a glance. "I've got it covered," he had said dismissively, brushing past her without waiting for a response. As the judge called the court to order, Sophia's pulse quickened. The prosecutor presented their opening argument, painting Luis as a desperate man who had turned to crime to support his struggling family. Sophia clenched her fists. The narrative was almost insulting in its simplicity, relying more on stereotypes than facts. When it was the defense's turn to speak, her frustration boiled over. The public defender stammered through a half-hearted argument, barely challenging the prosecution's claims. He didn't even mention that Luis had an alibi. Sophia's hand shot up instinctively, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "Objection, Your Honor," she said loudly, standing from her seat. Heads turned, and a collective murmur rippled through the crowd. The judge, an older man with a stern expression, glared at her over his glasses. "Who are you, and why are you interrupting my court?" he demanded. "I'm Sophia Miller," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "I'm here to support the defendant, and I believe there are inconsistencies in the prosecution's evidence that need to be addressed." The courtroom fell silent. The judge arched an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Miss Miller, unless you've suddenly acquired a law degree, I suggest you sit down and remain silent." A few people chuckled, but Sophia held her ground. "With all due respect, Your Honor, the prosecution hasn't provided any corroborating evidence beyond an eyewitness account. The reliability of such testimony is widely disputed, especially when there's no forensic evidence to support it." The judge sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Miss Miller, this is not the place for you to play legal scholar. Sit down, or I'll have you removed." Sophia hesitated, her cheeks burning with humiliation. But as she locked eyes with Luis, who sat shackled at the defense table, she saw the flicker of hope in his expression. Taking a deep breath, she sat back down, her resolve hardening. They could mock her all they wanted, but this wasn't over. Sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, the dim light of her laptop screen reflecting off her determined face. The humiliation in the courtroom still stung, but it had also ignited a fire inside her. She couldn't stand by and watch Luis be railroaded by a system that didn't care about the truth. If his public defender wouldn't fight for him, she would. Her notebook lay open beside her, filled with questions and observations about the case. Why hadn't Luis's alibi been mentioned in court? Why wasn't the lack of forensic evidence being scrutinized? And most importantly, why did the prosecution seem so confident despite their flimsy evidence? She needed answers, and she needed them fast. The first thing she did was track down the court records for Luis's case. It wasn't easy. She had to navigate a labyrinth of public databases and pay a small fee for the documents. But when she finally pulled up the preliminary report, she was appalled. The prosecution's argument relied almost entirely on the testimony of one witness, a man who claimed to have seen Luis running from the jewelry store. The security camera footage was so grainy that it could have been anyone. There was no physical evidence tying Luis to the scene, no weapon, and no motive beyond the vague suggestion that he needed money. Sophia leaned back, her mind racing. This wasn't just negligence. It felt intentional, as though someone had decided Luis was guilty and built a case around that assumption. She couldn't shake the eerie familiarity of it all. It was exactly what had happened to Ethan. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at her door. Her mother entered, her face lined with worry. "Sophia, you've been at this all day. You need to eat something," she said, setting a plate of food on the desk. "I'm fine, Mom," Sophia replied, barely looking up. "I just need to figure this out." Her mother sighed and sat on the edge of the bed. "I know you want to help, but this isn't your fight. You're just a kid. Let the lawyers handle it." Sophia snapped her laptop shut and looked at her mother, frustration simmering in her eyes. "Let the lawyers handle it? Like they handled Ethan's case? If I don't do something, Luis is going to end up in the same place Ethan is, and we both know it." Her mother didn't respond, but the pained look on her face was answer enough. After a moment, she stood and left the room without another word. Sophia felt a pang of guilt, but pushed it aside. She didn't have time for doubt, not when Luis's future was at stake. The next morning, she walked to the Reyes household with her notebook and laptop in tow. Maria opened the door, her face weary but hopeful. "I need to talk to Luis," Sophia said. "I need to hear his side of the story." Maria hesitated, then nodded. "He's allowed visitors today. Let me call his attorney." "No," Sophia interrupted. "I'll go alone." She knew she wasn't a lawyer, but she had something just as valuable, the determination to find the truth. Sophia stood in the sterile, dimly lit visitors' room of the county jail, her heart pounding in her chest. Across the table sat Luis, his hands cuffed and his face etched with exhaustion. The man who had once been a cheerful presence in the neighborhood now looked broken, the weight of the accusations crushing him. Sophia hesitated for a moment, unsure how to begin, but then she reminded herself why she was here. She had to do this for Luis, for his family, and for the truth. "Luis," she started, her voice steady, "I need you to tell me everything. From the beginning. What happened that night?" Luis's eyes searched hers, a mixture of skepticism and desperation. "You're just a kid, Sophia," he said quietly. "What can you do that my lawyer can't?" "Your lawyer isn't doing anything," she replied bluntly. "I've read the case files. The prosecution's story doesn't add up, but I can't fight it if I don't know your side. Please just trust me." Luis hesitated, then nodded, his shoulders sagging as he leaned forward. "I was home all night," he said. "I was watching TV with Maria and the kids. Around 10 p.m. I went to bed. The next thing I know, the police are banging on my door, saying I robbed a jewelry store and killed someone. I told them it wasn't true, but they wouldn't listen. They just kept saying, 'We know it was you.'" Sophia jotted down notes, her mind racing. What about the eyewitness? Do you know who they are? Luis shook his head. No idea. They say someone saw me running from the store, but I've never even been to that place. I don't understand how they can just make something like that stick. Sophia paused, tapping her pen against her notebook. And the security footage. Have you seen it? Luis frowned. My lawyer showed me a still image. It's grainy and dark. The guy in the picture is wearing a hoodie, and you can't even see his face clearly. But they're saying it's me, because it matches my bill. This is ridiculous, she muttered. They're building their case on guesswork. Luis gave a bitter laugh. Welcome to the system, he said. They don't care if you're innocent, they just need someone to blame. Sophia's grip on her pen tightened. She refused to accept that. Luis, do you have anyone who can back up your alibi? Maybe a neighbor who saw you at home? Luis shook his head. No one saw me. We were inside all night. Sophia nodded, her determination solidifying. Okay, I'll figure it out. There has to be something they overlooked. Some piece of evidence that clears your name. I just need time. Luis looked at her, a glimmer of hope flickering in his eyes. You really believe you can help me? Sophia met his gaze, her voice firm. I don't just believe it, Luis. I'm going to prove it. As she left the jail, her mind churned with possibilities. She couldn't do this alone. If she was going to take on the system, she needed help, and she knew exactly who to ask. Sophia stood outside a dimly lit coffee shop, clutching her notebook tightly. The night air was cool, and the faint hum of passing cars filled the silence. As she waited, she had called in a favor from someone she never thought she'd have to reach out to, Emily Carter, a disgraced former attorney who had been disbarred after taking the fall for a high-profile corruption case. Sophia had read about her during her obsessive research on legal professionals and knew that while Emily had lost everything, her knowledge of the law was unparalleled. It was a gamble, but Sophia was out of options. The door to the coffee shop opened, and a woman in her late 30s stepped out, her tired eyes scanning the street. She wore a worn leather jacket, and her hair was pulled into a messy bun. Spotting Sophia, she approached with a wary expression. "You're the kid who's been emailing me non-stop?" she asked, her tone flat. Sophia straightened, trying to appear confident despite the lump in her throat. "Yes, I need your help." Emily raised an eyebrow. "You're not exactly my usual clientele. What do you want from me?" Sophia took a deep breath. "I'm trying to prove my neighbor's innocence. He's been accused of a robbery and murder he didn't commit, and the evidence against him is paper thin. His lawyer isn't doing his job, and I can't just stand by and let him go to prison. I've read your cases. You know how to fight. This system..." Emily sighed and crossed her arms. "Look, kid, I'm not a lawyer anymore. Whatever you've read about me, it doesn't change the fact that I can't step into a courtroom." "I don't need you to go to court," Sophia said quickly. "I need your expertise. Just help me figure out what to do, where to look, how to dismantle their case. You don't have to risk anything." Emily stared at her for a long moment, before letting out a bitter laugh. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But do you even know what you're up against? The system doesn't care about the truth. It cares about closing cases." Sophia's jaw tightened. "I know. My brother's been in prison for 5 years because of it. That's why I can't let this happen to Luis. I need your help, Emily. Please." Emily's expression softened, and she studied the determined teenager in front of her. After a moment, she nodded. "Fine, but this isn't charity. If I help you, I expect you to actually listen and not pull any stunts. Got it?" Sophia nodded eagerly. "Got it." The next day, armed with Emily's advice, Sophia met with Jake, a tech-savvy hacker she had befriended during her research into Ethan's case. She knew Jake could access files and data the police wouldn't willingly share. Convincing him was easier than she expected. "If they're hiding something, I'll find it," Jake said confidently, cracking his knuckles, with her team coming. Together, Sophia felt a flicker of hope. But as the pieces started to fall into place, she began noticing strange cars parked outside her house and unfamiliar faces at her usual haunts. The message was clear. Someone didn't want her digging deeper. The stakes were rising, and she was just getting started. Sophia sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open and her notebook spread out beside it. Emily's advice had been invaluable, and Jake's technical skills had given them access to police reports and evidence files that weren't supposed to be public. But as she scanned through the data, her stomach twisted. The prosecution had introduced new evidence, a shoe print found at the crime scene, supposedly matching a pair of boots Louise owned. It was a devastating blow, and it had shaken her confidence. Across the room, Emily leaned against the counter, sipping coffee. "They're stacking the deck," she said bluntly. "They know the eyewitness testimony isn't enough, so they're fabricating evidence with his laptop." Nodded grimly. "I found some discrepancies in the timestamps on the security footage they submitted. It looks like someone tampered with it, but proving that in court will be tricky." Sophia buried her head in her hands, frustration bubbling over. "This is exactly what happened with Ethan," she said, her voice shaking. "They're not even trying to prove he's guilty. They just want to close the case." Emily set her coffee down and pulled out a chair. "Listen, kid. You're in over your head. This isn't just about Luis anymore. Whoever's behind this has real power, and they won't hesitate to come after you if you push too hard." "I can't stop now," Sophia said, lifting her head. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. "If I give up, Luis goes to prison. His kids grow up without a father. I'm not letting that happen." Emily sighed and sat back. "Then we need to hit them where it hurts. Find the cracks in their story and make them impossible to ignore." Jake interrupted, tapping furiously on his keyboard. "I think I've got something. The officer who found the shoe print. He's got a history of disciplinary issues, including evidence mishandling. It was buried deep, but it's there." Sophia's eyes lit up. "That's it. If we can prove the shoe print evidence is unreliable, we can dismantle their entire narrative." Before they could celebrate, a loud knock at the door startled them. Sophia's mother appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "Sophia, there are 2 men outside asking for you." Sophia's heart pounded as she stood and peeked through the window. 2 men in suits stood on the porch, their expressions unreadable. She recognized one of them from the courtroom, an assistant to the prosecutor. Emily stepped forward, her face darkening. "Let me handle this," she said, moving to the door. She opened it just wide enough to speak. "Can I help you?" "We're here to speak with Sophia Miller," one of the men said. "She's busy," Emily replied curtly. "Anything you need to say can go through me." The men exchanged a glance. "Just let her know this isn't her fight. It's in her best interest to let the professionals handle it." They left without another word, but the message was clear. As the door closed, Sophia's resolve hardened. If they were trying to scare her, it only meant she was getting closer to the truth. She glanced at Emily and Jake. "We keep going," she said firmly. "No matter what." The fear in her chest was real, but so was her determination. They wouldn't stop her, not now, not ever. Sophia stared at the screen in front of her, her eyes scanning the reports Jake had just unearthed. It was right there in black and white. The officer who had discovered the shoe print linking Luis to the crime scene had been reprimanded multiple times for mishandling evidence. In one instance, he had even admitted to planting items to strengthen a weak case. Yet somehow he was still on the force, and now his name was tied to Luis's case. Sophia felt a surge of anger, but she quickly refocused. This was exactly the kind of crack she needed to widen. Emily leaned over her shoulder, reading the report. "This guy's a liability. If we can get him on the stand, his entire credibility will crumble." Sophia nodded, already taking notes. "We need to make this public. If the jury knows about his history, they'll question everything he's touched." Jake interjected, glancing up from his laptop. "Careful. If we go public with this too soon, they'll have time to spin it. We need to make sure we have undeniable proof before we throw it into the spotlight." Sophia agreed, though the weight of the decision pressed heavily on her. Every move she made felt like walking a tightrope, too cautious, and Luis would lose his chance at justice. Too bold, and she risked everything falling apart. She took a deep breath and looked at Jake. "What else did you find?" Jake hesitated before turning the laptop to face her. "This." He clicked on a file, revealing a series of emails between the district attorney's office, and the head of a private security firm. The messages were coded, but one thing was clear. The firm was tied to the jewelry store robbery. Payments were exchanged right before and after the crime, and the descriptions of services rendered were suspiciously vague. Sophia's jaw dropped. "Are you telling me the DA is working with the people who actually committed the robbery?" Jake shrugged. "It's not enough to prove that yet, but it's a lead. If we can link them to the fabricated evidence, it could blow the case wide open." Emily frowned. "This is dangerous territory. If the DA is involved, we're not just exposing corruption. We're going up against the entire system." Sophia met her gaze, her expression unyielding. "I don't care how dangerous it is. If they're framing Luis to protect themselves, they need to be stopped." Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The trial was only a week away, and the prosecution would be working just as hard to solidify their case. The pressure was suffocating, but she refused to let it break her. Luis's life and her brother's hope depended on her. Later that night, Sophia sat alone in her room, staring at a picture of Ethan. She thought about the years he had lost, the dreams that had been stolen from him. "I won't let them win again," she whispered. Determined, she began drafting her argument. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about proving that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. The courtroom was packed as the trial began, the air heavy with anticipation. Sophia sat at the defense table beside Luis and his public defender, her notebook open and pen in hand. She wasn't supposed to be there, but Luis had insisted. "You're the only one fighting for me," he had said. The public defender had reluctantly allowed her to sit in, but he made it clear she was not to interfere. Sophia ignored him. She wasn't here to stay quiet. The prosecution opened with confidence, presenting their case as if it were already a foregone conclusion. They paraded the eyewitness to the stand, a middle-aged man who claimed he had seen Luis running from the jewelry store. Sophia listened intently, her pen moving furiously as she jotted down every inconsistency in his testimony. The man's story was shaky, full of vague details and moments where he hesitated. When the defense attorney failed to press him on these points during cross-examination, Sophia clenched her fists under the table. The prosecution then introduced the grainy security footage and the shoe print evidence. Sophia watched as they described the supposed match between the print and Luis's boots, her frustration mounting. She knew the officer who had found the print had a history of misconduct, but the defense attorney didn't bring it up. He barely questioned the validity of the evidence at all, sticking to generic objections that the judge overruled with ease. When the prosecution rested, Sophia leaned over to the public defender. "You need to challenge the officer who found the print. His record is full of misconduct." The lawyer shot her a sharp look. "Stay out of this. I know what I'm doing." Sophia's jaw tightened, but she stayed silent. She couldn't risk being thrown out of the courtroom, not when so much was at stake. Instead, she focused on what she could do. During the recess, she handed the public defender a detailed list of questions to ask the officer, highlighting his history and the discrepancies in his report. When the defense called the officer to the stand, Sophia held her breath. To her surprise, the public defender used her notes, grilling the officer on his past misconduct. The courtroom buzzed as the officer squirmed under the scrutiny, his answers evasive and defensive. It was a small victory, but it gave Sophia hope. Then came the pivotal moment. The defense called Jake to the stand. His testimony revealed the tampered timestamps in the security footage and the suspicious financial transactions linked to the private security firm. The prosecutor objected furiously, but the judge allowed it. Jake's calm, methodical explanation painted a damning picture of corruption and manipulation. As the day ended, Sophia felt the tide beginning to turn. The prosecution's once solid case was starting to crack, and the jury's expressions showed doubt. But she knew the fight wasn't over. The system wouldn't go down without a fight, and the hardest battles were still ahead. With renewed determination, she prepared for what would come next. The truth was finally within reach, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. The courtroom was electric the next morning as Sophia and her small team prepared for what could be the most pivotal moment in the trial. The prosecutor, clearly rattled from the previous day, had doubled down on their argument, calling in a forensic expert to validate the shoe print evidence. But Sophia wasn't worried about the expert. She was focused on the bombshell they were about to drop. As the prosecutor wrapped up their questioning, the defense attorney stood, papers trembling slightly in his hands. "Your Honor, the defense would like to call an additional witness to the stand," he announced. The prosecutor's head snapped up, confusion flickering across his face. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at his docket. "Proceed." Man in his late 40s stepped forward, his tailored suit crisp and his demeanor professional. This was Daniel Harper, a whistleblower from the private security firm Jake had uncovered. He had reached out to Emily after the evidence about the firm's involvement came to light, willing to testify about what he knew. Sophia had spent hours prepping him the night before, ensuring every detail of his story. The defense attorney began. "Can you tell the court your role at Sentinel Security?" "I was the regional operations manager," Harper replied, his voice steady. "I oversaw contracts and personnel for high-value accounts, including the one held by Gold Standard Jewelers. And what was your involvement with the case against Luis Reyes?" Harper hesitated, glancing at the judge before continuing. "After the robbery, I was instructed by my superiors to deliver falsified reports to law enforcement. These reports included fabricated surveillance footage and doctored evidence." A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. The prosecutor immediately stood. "Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay and completely unsubstantiated." The judge raised a hand to silence him. "I'll allow it. Continue, Mr. Harper." Harper nodded. "I was told to ensure the blame fell on Luis Reyes. It was part of a broader effort to protect certain interests tied to the robbery." Sophia watched the jury closely, noting their wide eyes and furrowed brows. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Harper's testimony dismantled the foundation of the prosecution's case, revealing the lengths to which the system had gone to frame Luis. The prosecutor tried to cross-examine him, but Harper remained calm and unwavering, his answers precise and damning. When Harper stepped down, the defense attorney turned to the judge. "Your Honor, in light of this testimony, we request the immediate dismissal of all evidence submitted by Sentinel Security as unreliable and prejudicial." The judge leaned back in his chair, clearly deep in thought. After a long pause, he nodded. "Motion granted." The prosecution's case was collapsing. Sophia could feel the shift in the room, the weight of doubt tipping the scales. As the day ended, she left the courthouse with Luis's family, the first glimmers of hope shining in their eyes. But Sophia knew the battle wasn't over yet. The system wasn't defeated, it was cornered, and that made it even more dangerous. The final day of the trial was tense, the courtroom buzzing with anticipation. The prosecution had been dealt significant blows over the past week, but they weren't going down without a fight. Their closing arguments leaned heavily on emotion, painting Luis as a man driven to desperation by his financial struggles. They appealed to the jury's fears, emphasizing the need for justice for the victim. It was a calculated, manipulative tactic, but Sophia could see it had some effect on a few of the jurors. She clenched her fists, willing herself to stay calm. When it was time for the defense's closing argument, the public defender stood, but this time he carried a newfound confidence. He had spent the night reviewing the evidence and notes Sophia had provided, and it showed. He began by dismantling the prosecution's narrative piece by piece, pointing out the lack of forensic evidence and the inconsistencies in the eyewitness testimony. He highlighted the officer's history of misconduct and Harper's bombshell testimony, which had exposed the corruption at the heart of the case. "The system isn't infallible," he said, pacing in front of the jury. "It's run by people and people make mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes are accidental, but in this case they were deliberate. Luis Reyes wasn't arrested because he was guilty. He was arrested because he was convenient." The words hung in the air, and Sophia could feel the tension shift again. She glanced at the jury, seeing a mix of anger and uncertainty on their faces. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and they were starting to take root. As the defense wrapped up, Luis turned to Sophia, his voice low. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." She managed a small smile, but her nerves were stretched thin. The fate of the case and Luis's life was now in the hands of 12 strangers. The jury deliberated for hours, the clock ticking agonizingly slowly. Luis's family sat quietly, their hands clasped in silent prayer. Sophia paced the hallway outside the courtroom, her mind racing. Had they done enough? Was the truth enough to outweigh the lies? Finally, the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. Everyone filed back into the courtroom, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Sophia sat beside Luis, her hands gripping the edge of the table as the judge called the court to order. The 4 persons stood, holding the verdict in their hands. "On the charge of first-degree robbery," they began, "we find the defendant, Luis Reyes, not guilty." The words hit like a wave of relief. Luis's family erupted into quiet sobs, and Sophia felt tears sting her own eyes. The 4-person continued, clearing him of all charges, and the judge dismissed the case. It was over. Luis was free. As the courtroom emptied, Sophia stood outside with Luis and his family, the weight of the moment sinking in. She had exposed the truth and given an innocent man his life back, but deep down, she knew her fight wasn't over. There was still Ethan, and now, with everything she had learned, she was more determined than ever to bring him home. The day after Luis was cleared of all charges, Sophia stood in front of the prison gates, clutching a folder packed with notes, evidence, and a growing list of contacts she had made over the past few months. The gates loomed tall and cold, a stark reminder of the years her brother Ethan had spent behind them. For the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope as she prepared to visit him. Luis's case had proven something vital, not just to her, but to everyone who had doubted her. The system could be fought and, with enough determination, beaten. Inside the visiting area, Ethan sat at a small table, his posture weary but his face lighting up as soon as he saw Sophia. His once vibrant personality had dulled over the years, replaced by a quiet resignation. But today, there was something different in his eyes. A spark of curiosity and hope he hadn't let himself feel in years. Sophia slid into the chair across from him, placing the folder between them. "You were amazing," Ethan said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I heard about Luis. The whole prison did. They're calling you a miracle worker." Sophia laughed softly, shaking her head. "I'm no miracle worker. I just didn't let them win." Ethan leaned forward, his tone serious. "It's more than that, Soph. You fought for him like no one else could, like you're still fighting for me." Her chest tightened at his words, and she nodded. "That's why I'm here," she said, pushing the folder toward him. "I'm reopening your case." Ethan's expression shifted, a mixture of hope and disbelief. "Soph, we've been down this road before. I don't want you to get hurt again." "I'm not the same person I was back then," she said firmly. "I know how to fight now. I have people who can help. Emily, Jake, even Luis's family, they all want to see this through." He opened the folder, his hands shaking slightly as he leafed through the documents. Inside were pages detailing the evidence used against him, witness testimonies riddled with inconsistencies, and new information Sophia had uncovered linking his conviction to the same corrupt network that had targeted Luis. It was all there, neatly organized and painstakingly researched. "They didn't just make a mistake, Ethan," Sophia continued. "They framed you, and I can prove it." Ethan's eyes met hers, and for the first time in years, tears welled up in them. "You really believe you can win?" "I don't just believe it," she said, her voice steady. "I know it." The guard signaled that visiting time was over, and Ethan closed the folder, clutching it tightly. As he stood, he looked at Sophia with a newfound determination. "You've always been my little sister," he said quietly, "but now you're my hero." Sophia smiled as she watched him walk away, the weight of his words sinking in. The fight ahead would be long and grueling, but she wasn't afraid. She had proven that the truth could prevail, and she wasn't stopping until Ethan was free. As she stepped outside into the sunlight, she felt a sense of purpose, stronger than ever before. This was only the beginning.